First of all, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Ian Gulland. I'm the Chief Exec at Zero Waste Scotland. And before I introduce the film, just say a few words of introduction. There's one thing I do want to just say, and it's the usual thing that I possibly should have said earlier today. For those of you who have been around for most of the day, we've been running a series of sessions throughout the day. This is the last one, the fifth one, and it's been a magnificent effort by my team at Zero Waste Scotland to put this on. So this is a hybrid event, just flag that up to everybody, which is one of the reasons we were keen to get you in your seats. There's, as well as the people who have attended in person, there's another 1,200 people have been connecting online throughout the day. So there's a number of people watching this remotely, so just be keen to keep it to time, so to speak. But it's been a great team effort by Zero Waste Scotland. I would just like to thank the team for that, particularly colleagues that are here today, Kelly, who really has done all our work in the run-up to COP26, and her team, Michelle as well, who's been on the ground here. But not just that, the whole comms team, and not just for today, because we've been participating and partnering on a number of events already last week, and through myself as well. So all the briefings that have been promptly dispatched to me ahead of events, I thank you very much for that, and keeping me right. So it's something I usually forget to say. So thank you to my team. So anyway, why are we here? So probably know, in the run-up to COP26, we were obviously very keen as Zero Waste Scotland to be as much involved in that as possible, both in the kind of more formal stuff that's happening in the Blue Zone, but also on the fringe events as well. But we did recognise that, well, we felt there was two particular conversations missing in the COP26 agenda. They're both linked conversations. One of them primarily is what we're going to talk about tonight, is just the issue of consumption, overconsumption or unsmart consumption that is having a huge detrimental impact, not just here in Scotland but globally. We feel we really need to have a conversation about that, and we've been running a number of events in the run-up to COP to really start a conversation, a much more deep-rooted conversation about consumption, to try and highlight that we need, if we're serious, not just here in Scotland but globally, if we're serious about ending climate change, we all need to start thinking differently about consumption and doing and consuming differently. So linked to that is the second thing that we wanted to highlight was food waste, the issue of food waste, again, not just here in Scotland but globally, and the impact of that. So that's again linked to that consumption agenda. So today has really been about that. How do we have that conversation? So we've run a number of sessions. We've been highlighting the progress we've been making here in Scotland around the circular economy, which we believe is a real opportunity to reduce that impact of consumption. So we've been looking at the progress we've been making at a national level in our cities, and possibly more important with some of the business community that we've been supporting. But we thought the purpose of tonight is really to bring it all back to that central feature around consumption and why we have to break it. So people have probably heard this before from Zero Waste Scotland. 4/5 of Scotland's carbon footprint comes from basically the extraction of raw materials, production of products, and basically the consumption of them, and ultimately the waste of them. And a lot of that is obviously, as we know, wasted after just one use. So that extraction globally is not just from Scotland but from all countries, is responsible for 50% of carbon emissions. Possibly more importantly, it's responsible for 90% of biodiversity loss and water stress. So absolutely, biodiversity is now on the agenda at COP26. That's great, but we actually start to really talk about consumption in that space as well. So whilst all the numbers are important, and I could stand up here and talk about all these numbers and the impact that we're having in Scotland and other countries are having globally, what we really need to do is understand what underlies that consumption. What are the behaviours? What are the kind of drivers that are driving us individually and our economies to consume more and more? But thankfully, we've been thinking about this for some time. This is not something we just decided in the run-up to COP. We started thinking about how do we decouple growth from resource use, started to have those conversations as an organisation, led by an ex-colleague, Jack Barry, who's in the audience tonight. And he managed to get some influential people around the table to really try and think about that from a Scottish perspective. How do we really start to decouple that? And we were very conscious that things did shift when that group got together. We sort of then fell into a pandemic scenario, and the group really couldn't get together to do what they would probably want to do and bounce ideas off each other. It all kind of went online. But we also recognised the importance of this work, because when we went back to a previous economic crash in 2007, 2008, everybody remember that, you know, the bounce back from that was that we were all told we had to get the economy back on. So everybody went out and was kind of encouraged, not just here in the UK, but globally, to go and consume as much as possible and create, you know, create business and commerce. And we saw a massive, you know, increase in the consumption of raw materials. So with that scenario in mind, we were very keen, well, we don't want to go back to that again once we come out of the pandemic. So the kind of context for the work that group that Jack set up was really to start to think of it within, you know, the green recovery, which was being spoken about. Unfortunately, possibly quite optimistically, it was being spoken about almost within a couple of months of the first lockdown. And obviously that, you know, the green recovery is to some extent still in front of us as we come out of the pandemic situation. So a report was released. The report was published last summer last year, 2020, about how, you know, Scotland can, you know, start to decouple, start to frame our green recovery in terms of that decoupling scenario. And at the same time, a decision was made to make a film about it, to really bring it to life. So yes, the report is there, but let's make a film and really bring this to a wider audience. So that was commissioned, and again, obviously because of pandemic situation, it's taken a lot longer to come to fruition than we would imagine. And I'm really delighted that Janine is here, the filmmaker. Hi, Janine. So she's been waiting for months, possibly longer, to see the fruition of her labours. So welcome, Janine. So the plan is I'm going to obviously get off the stage, leave you to watch the film, and then the plan is to have a panel session with some of the protagonists from the film, with a few others, to try and reflect on what the film is saying and what the report said, to kind of summarise, but also in the context that we now find ourselves in terms of COP26. The plan was, you know, in my eyes, the plan was to get, it was almost like, you know, one of these programmes you see on the telly, is to get the protagonists around the table, having a drink, having a chat, talking about what they just watched on television or something, and we'd all be kind of eavesdropping in. If you get that kind of vibe. That's obviously very difficult to do in this circumstance. So I'm just saying to the protagonist, when you get up here, try and have that conversation going. If you haven't got a drink, we'll get a drink across to you, because that might help. But this is just an opportunity to really, because we know that what this is all about is quite uncomfortable, you know, for people to think about, particularly many of our politicians, to really try and talk openly about how do we reduce the impact of our consumption, and, you know, think differently about how the economy could be structured, and what is the aim of our economy, what are we trying to achieve both for Scotland, but actually more importantly for the global community. So I'm going to sit down, watch the film, then I'll ask the protagonists, or I don't know how I'm going to call you now, guests, I should say, to come up and sit up, and we'll start a conversation. Okay, thank you. Scotland and the rest of the world have declared a climate emergency. Global emissions are destroying our planet. If we carry on as we are, it's going to get worse. But as we tackle one of the biggest challenges of our generation, there's one vital part of the conversation missing. About 4/5 of Scotland's carbon footprint comes from the products and materials we manufacture, use and dispose of. The average Scot consumes 18.4 tonnes of materials every year, and scientists would say a more sustainable level is around 8 tonnes per person per year.
If we don't take this moment and this opening up of this conversation about a different economic system, today's generations and future generations will never, ever forgive us.
There is nothing else to do if we fail in this. And quite frankly, if we do, the planet is not going to care how much our economy is growing.
So the advisory group was looking at this green growth agenda that essentially says we can decouple economic growth from the environmental impact, and we can call that green growth because we'll still have GDP growth, but it won't be doing damage to the planet. The problem is that so much of the evidence shows that that's just not possible to the extent that's required. What we need to do is design our economic systems that are not dependent on growth in the first place. We can't rely on growth or have an economy designed around growth to serve what we're really after, which is good quality of lives for people on a sustainable planet. And so into that space, the wellbeing economy agenda seemed to fit really nicely.
Well-being is spending quality time as a family, and that would mean either you're sitting for meals together. Ever since I had my kids, I've only worked part-time, and even that, sometimes I've had to stop work completely to prioritise the kids. Healthy family, I would say, is much more important than having that extra cash.
One of the key elements of a wellbeing economy is about saying it's humanity that should determine economics rather than the other way around. So you can imagine if someone in Glasgow, for example, here was walking down the street in an economy that was much more aligned to what people on planet need. Firstly, those streets would be safe, there'd be more green space, there'd be local shops, probably where they know the shop owner. They might be worker cooperatives even, where the people working for those firms own the firm. There'd probably be community gardens that they could stop in their way and maybe pick some carrots or an apple and sit down on a bench and have a conversation with people. And they'd have time to do that because they wouldn't be having to work 3 jobs just to put food on the table. And so the wellbeing economy doesn't just bring a different vision, it also brings hope that that change is possible because it's made up of people and activists and scholars and business people and networks who are already rolling up their sleeves and putting these sorts of changes into practice.
Improving the rental market and improving housing in general is absolutely vital to the wellbeing economy. There's very little more fundamental than having a secure, affordable, warm roof over your head. So if we can't get housing right, we can't get anything else right in the wellbeing economy. Right now, the rental system is very heavily weighted towards landlords, and it has been moving that way for many years. A lot of tenants have very insecure tenures. They can be removed from their rented property with very little notice and very little reason. They're often paying very high rents, especially compared to what an owner-occupier would pay in equivalent for a mortgage. So you have people who end up getting trapped in the rented sector because they can't pay these higher rents and simultaneously save for a deposit to buy a house.
I literally earn money to pay for childcare and there's very little left over to live, never mind put aside anything for a deposit for a mortgage. So I have no choice, I have to rent. There's been consistently problems with heating. There's several places through the house you can actually feel the breeze coming through. The biggest one was probably the boiler when we were left without heating or hot water for the entire winter. I was very fortunate in that for the first maybe 7 years that I lived there, we didn't see any increases in rent whatsoever. But then I had the situation with the boiler, and within a month of that, I got my letter saying that your rent will be going up by £50 a month. And then when that year was passed, I got another letter saying your rent is going up by £50 a month. I did get a letter from my landlord assuring me that it was only so much due to the fact that we'd lived there so long without any rent increases. If that had been spread out over those 7 years, that would have been so much easier. I'm not actually demonising, because in many ways I think a big part of the issue is that they're not incredibly well informed.
Very notably, we did a joint paper with Living Rent on a system of rent controls that could work in Scotland. These rent controls would be based directly on the quality of the house in question, and with an intention of incentivising improvements to that house. It would also secure tenants against year-on-year rent rises, and ultimately should encourage landlords to bring their houses up to the standards we expect for the Green New Deal. We're also looking at improving the general housing infrastructure in Scotland. Scotland's houses are expensive, they're small, they're cold, they are not ready for the Green New Deal.
We need to have a mindset, a change of mindset. And the big driver for consumption is how cheap everything is and how easy, how disposable everything is. Clothes, you can go online now and have clothes delivered the next day and wear it once and discard it. This rattan type imitation furniture. One day I'll go out of fashion and it'll be some other thing they're looking for. And your mum will be binning that and asking you to go and buy something else.
So circular economy is about saying, one, let's reduce the amount of stuff that we use and consume, but when we do need to use stuff and consume stuff and produce stuff, let's do so in a way that redesigns something. So it could be your phone, we could repackage that and utilise the minerals and the resources that are in that. So it's about saying we're going to keep the materials in our production circulating, and that requires engineers, it requires creativity and creative designers.
Young people have really creative and ambitious ideas about tackling some of the problems that we have within our linear economy. There's such a big opportunity there to really harness the skills and energy in young people in Scotland to push that towards creating a circular economy, and I think that would also give young people a real sense of hopefulness that they can actually contribute to solving some of these environmental issues that we're facing. Claire's innovation around reusable packaging and reusable solutions for packaging is so exciting, and it shows that young people have really creative and ambitious ideas.
I was so frustrated by the fact that I could see the problems mounting up in an environmental sense around me, and yet I was not spending a minute of my day, my working day, tackling them. We actually launched a campaign to email all the brands that we had in our bathroom cabinets to ask them why they weren't using reusable packaging. And some of the responses we got back were really helpful, actually, because they really helped us get to the heart of the problem very quickly. So one of the things that we were told was that packaging, in order to be safe for consumers, needs to be stamped with a batch code. And that's done usually with laser ink to make sure it never comes off. That becomes quite challenging when you're reusing packaging because you need to figure out a way to get rid of that stamp and re-stamp it. We also had businesses saying that they were really struggling to identify what kind of packaging and the design. A lot of different things need to happen to that packaging in its life cycle, and they don't know if it's going to last 100 times or just 10, and how do you design for that? And then businesses said, well, I have an inventory management system. As soon as I'm reusing packaging, I have to think about it coming back. We realized if we give every single piece of packaging a unique ID, then you can, it's almost like a passport. So every time it gets filled with a new product or cleaned or goes out to a customer, it gets another stamp in its passport.
So all the products are presented in bamboo, glass and aluminium packaging with very minimal plastic. We are really excited to be embarking on this project with Wreath in order to enable us to reuse the packaging. Hi!
Hi, how are you?
I'm good.
You said that you were setting up the scanner.
Luckily, the second phone that I've got, it's okay. So is it literally just a case of I can start putting these on now and then just going for it?
I hope that it's relatively intuitive.
You can use a smartphone to scan these QR codes, which will be on the packaging, which then links to the Wreath platform and enables the tracking facility, which is exciting.
So I think it's really important that we continue to invest in young innovation because the perspective that you have on the world is quite different. You're possibly more up to speed with the latest technology, and it's really that systems thinking and joining the dots that's really critical. And I think when you don't know how things are done, you're able to paint a new picture of how they could be done.
Scotland has set a net zero target for 2045. A net zero meaning that there are no net emissions of greenhouse gases from Scotland. It's difficult to overstate how ambitious this target is. It means having no petrol and diesel vehicles on the roads. It means having no gas for heating, for central heating, and about over 80% of our homes are heated in this way. So the work that I'm involved in is working with cities, with local authorities to support them in delivering their climate goals. But when we're talking about delivering climate goals, we're talking about fundamentally changing the system within which the city operates. The City of Edinburgh Council is developing out a very large swathe of North Edinburgh called the Granton Waterfront Development. And that's the work that some of the work that I am involved in with Edinburgh is supporting them in terms of developing some of the ideas and testing some of those ideas in practice as to how you can build new net zero developments.
This project will be a first for Edinburgh, and at scale it will be a first for Scotland. In the context of a climate emergency, the construction industry really has to step up to the plate. This provides us with a major opportunity to demonstrate our ability and our desire to respond.
Granton is an example of a new development that supports well-being, green spaces,
active travel, rather than just thinking about it as a sort of housing development.
The National Galleries of Scotland wanted to be part of a vibrant community and an area of regeneration in northwest Edinburgh. Looking after fine art requires us to control humidity, temperature levels, which traditionally has required very high energy solutions such as air conditioning. Using the passive house building standard, we can get those levels of temperature and humidity through very low energy solutions. The Artworks project, of course, isn't just about building a building that's efficient. It's also about the journey we're on. So, for example, on the Artworks site, we're fortunate enough to have installed a mobile orchard unit. We've been working closely with local schools and nursery groups using that space.
Trees! We have some wonderful paintings of orchards and of farming, so we thought it would be a wonderful way to introduce children to the collection and children to the opportunities here that the orchard offers. So we're really trying to build links now before the building has even started.
Should we make a pond? Yeah. Okay. I wonder how long it'll take to fill. The area that we live in scores quite highly on the Scottish SIMD index, and there are a lot of children who don't always get a lot of opportunities to explore outside. For me, it's a fantastic idea. It's just a dead space just now, and it's really, really important that the community has places to go, but that also the community is involved in developing those spaces, so there's a sense of ownership.
It's very easy to write papers to talk about the theory of trying to get to net zero, indeed of pledging net zero targets, climate goals. It's much harder in practice. We do not have all of the answers right now as to what is going to work best in which context. So actually we've got to go and test them, and that's what we've been doing as EIT Climate Kick with our partners like the City of Edinburgh Council, is to say let's go and learn at scale by trialling something, and once we've got that, we can learn fast from it and share that learning very rapidly across many other places, cities, urban areas.
My goal for Scotland, really the targets for the Green New Deal are out to 2045, which by coincidence is roughly when someone my age is just about ready to start thinking about retirement. So the Green New Deal really is my retirement plan for Scotland. I want to live in a Scotland that has averted the climate emergency, and we can sit back and see the results.
The social health and well-being will be greatly improved within Scotland if there was a broader range of equality, the acceptance of more cultures.
I'm not planning on it just now. We could end up raising kids here, and as my dad said earlier, it's a good place to raise kids, but you want it to be the best possible place to raise kids.
It's really exciting to be part of this because we are creating the type of future that I want to live in. So how do we value positive types of work that really capture people's imagination but also create positive results in society?
It's no longer a question of why. We know that time is now to transform the economic system. The question is, do we have the imagination to think about an economy that's better than growth?
Thank you. Thank you again. So I'm now going to ask my esteemed panel to join me. So we have Tim Jackson, Kathleen Trebek, who was in the film. If you just want to come up and grab your seats. Kate Chalmers, who was in the film. Ian Black, who wasn't in the film. Sorry. And Deirdre Shaw. So hopefully people recognise Tim Jackson, author, playwright as well. We've met Kate and Kathleen. Ian Black's from Stirling University, and Deirdre is from, I was going to say Glasgow. It is in Glasgow, isn't it? That's it. So I'm really going to, I don't want to really stand here and ask questions. I really do hope that you'll just converse, and maybe there's other people that would like to either make comments or ask questions. I mean, my point is, and I reflected what I said right at the beginning when I was introducing the film. I said, this is all uncomfortable. This is a kind of inconvenient truth, this thing about consumption, elephant in the room. These are all statements that I think I've been using for the last week. But actually, when you watch the film, listen to the presenters, but even the real people that you interviewed, it doesn't feel very uncomfortable. It feels great. It sounds great. So that's why, and I guess that's the point, isn't it? So we talk about this being something that we don't really want to talk about, politicians or otherwise don't want to talk about, but actually everybody else wants to talk about it. This is what they want to talk about. How do we make a systemic, system-wide change so it's not just good for the environment, but it's good for society, it's good for our own communities as well as a kind of global environment. And it's not just now, it's the future that we all want. So I guess that's possibly my way of kind of exiting and leaving it to you guys to talk about. So why is it such a thing that nobody wants to talk about? Why is this issue about consumption and changing the way that we frame society and seek some other, positive, ambition? Why is that such a thing that people find it hard to talk about, especially at this event in Glasgow? So who wants? I'll start with Deirdre and Tim, perhaps, and Ian, because you weren't in the film. So I'll let you start, and then the others can come in with their reflections, because they might have changed their reflections over the last 18 months. I'm sure they haven't, but they've probably built on it. So Deirdre, leave it with you.
Yeah, I guess I think it is something that we are actually talking about more now. Maybe not enough, but the whole climate and carbon, it's in everyday discourse in a way that it hadn't been before. And I know that there was a report that we're using the term cake more than climate change on UK TV. It might be the Power of Bake Off or something. But I think the challenge is for people to be able to understand this within their everyday lived experiences. So consumer culture and consumption is part of the infrastructure, the structure that we're actually operating in. And to step outside of that is actually quite challenging. And to step outside of that means, to be inconvenienced. It costs more to really seek out those alternatives. So one of the things that we really need is an infrastructure that supports behaving more sustainably and having those opportunities and pathways to action to do that in a way that allows you to step outside and to think about a kind of consumption culture, if you like. And also when things are so, the films mentioned, when things are so cheap and it's just easy to buy it and then dispose of it, then of course it's hard to think about how we can value things when we have them in that way. And to look after things and to maintain them and to repair them is more convenient than just replacing things and buying new. So we lose that sense of both physical and emotional durability in relation to the things that we do actually consume.
Yeah, good. I mean, because I wasn't in the film, I can comment on the film, right? And say what I think. I think it was in the style of the film noir from maybe Scandinavia. And so the black and white sequences I found really very good, very, very evocative. And I think they were trying to get us to figure out who the villain is. And I think I figured it out by the end. I'm not absolutely sure, but I think it was growth. And that is to some extent, one of the reasons why we find it hard to think about consumption, because certainly to an economist, growth is growth in the GDP. The GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net export. So it's really, as soon as you're driving growth, you're driving consumption. You want that consumption coming through as hard and as fast as possible. And you want your consumers out every Saturday morning going down to the DIY store, as I sometimes do on a Saturday morning when I've got a DIY project going. And if possible, you want the DIY store to be situated right next to the municipal recycling facility, which used to be called a dump. And most of it actually still, not most of it, but there's quite a lot of it, still is, relatively speaking, a dump. And if possible, you want, as you leave the DIY store, you want your rapidly bought purchase to be falling apart straight away. And then the distance between the DIY store and the dump is the smallest distance that you can arrange. And that's the rate. I mean, it sounds paradoxical. It sounds like I'm making fun of it, but I'm not. I mean, I'm furious about it. I find myself rigidly angry going into the DIY, purchasing something which is promising to be holding together for at least 5 minutes, and it's almost broken before I get out of the store, and then I have to go straight to the dump with it and throw it away. And that saves carbon because I don't have to take it home anywhere and don't have to live with it, which is probably good, but I don't think it's right. I think there is, and this ought to be something that consumers could get behind, that citizens could get behind. We don't want to buy rubbish. We don't want rubbish. We want something that we can attach to. We don't want something that's going to fall apart. And it's surprising to me that we are not yet at the position of having people really vociferous about the poor quality that is being sold on those temporary goods that come through as fast as possible. And there's two things to point out about it, I think. One is that it is driven from the heart of capitalism itself by the structure of profit maximization in firms. And as soon as you do that, then the people who are producing those goods have an incentive to produce and sell as many as possible, and for them to be thrown away as fast as possible, because otherwise they won't get the revenues for the next sales. If things last, durability is inimical to capitalism. And so we have to address that fundamental structure at the heart of capitalism. And then the other thing I would say is something that the sociologist Colin Campbell pointed out in one of his books, is when you start messing with consumption. So first of all, we're messing with consumption, we're messing with growth. Growth is part of the system that we live in. It's part of the DNA of capitalism. That's why it's hard from an institutional perspective. And the other perspective is, when you start messing with consumption, you are actually messing not just with materials, but with the entire social fabric of our lives. Our lives are constructed, particularly in a consumer capitalism, through our relationship to material things. And so we hand over to material things, not just the functioning of, a cupboard that I bought from the DIY store that falls apart as soon as I bought it, but actually our relationships to our family and our friends, our giving of gifts, our sense of status in our society, our ability to stand up in our peer group and say, I'm dressed okay today, so I belong, our ability to signal where we belong and how we belong and who we differentiate ourselves from and who we affiliate ourselves to. And sometimes even that sense of the meaning of things. There's a lovely book by the late Csikszentmihalyi about the meaning of things. Sometimes that role that we ask consumption to play is deeply embedded in our social and psychological needs, right down even perhaps sometimes to our spiritual needs. And that's something, again, that we have fallen into, as in part at least because of the economic system that we're living in, but also in part because of our human nature and the way in which humans have an innate ability to create symbolic significance out of material stuff. So as Colin Campbell said, once you start messing with consumption, you're messing with the most intimate parts of our lives.
I'm not going to be able to come up with as many authors in my speech. Thanks. I think for my answer here is that we are talking about this. There are lots of people are talking about this. We're just not being listened to. And I've got a sense, being in the blue zone of this COP, that research isn't being listened to either. Engineering solutions are being listened to, but social science is not being listened to. So when I had some, if we think about what we're trying to achieve with a well-being economy, that is on the lips of ordinary people who want a decent life, who want to spend time with their families, who want the simplicity of a meal round a table to them. These are the things that are being discussed and talked about. I had a brilliant discussion with my master's students today about what the meaning of sharing. I've got a wonderfully diverse group of students. So Nigerian men telling what sharing meant to them versus my Nigerian women, which is a different thing, supposedly. The Nigerian men give what they want to Nigerian women. The Nigerian women take it because they deserve to take it, and some wonderful discussions. So I think these conversations are alive. But then we go back to this piece of work, which I'm absolutely delighted that, to have been part of. Just so fantastic to have folk like Catherine on it. And I did a little bit of a tallying today. I went through the report and started looking at, well, how are we doing? How are we doing regarding the direction that COP is taking us in, this COP26? And there's kind of three main ideas that we had in the report. That there needs to be a reduction. There's a primary goal of reduction in what we consume. There needs to be systems change. And in order to change systems, you need to have change institutions. And of course, as Catherine was pointing out, you need to be able to imagine that there's a different system as possible. And I don't see anything in COP26 that's challenging those things. I haven't heard reduction at all. I've certainly not talked about systems change. I've heard a lot about of institutions being re-embedded. They're the ones that cause the problem being re-embedded. So I don't think we're doing particularly well there. The report had 3 limits on decoupling, and as far as I could see there, that we can't decouple quickly enough. And fast enough. Well, we're doing the opposite of that. The conversations about the major challenges in terms of things like technology solutions. We've got to be very careful of technology solutions because they get subverted within a system. We're not doing very well there. So basically, of the three main ideas, we're losing 3-0. Of the 3 limits on the decoupling discussion that we put through,
I think it's 5-1, isn't it?
It was 5-1, and the 1 is only because we're being ignored. And it's not as though this is us radical set of ideas from a small group of social scientists. There are hundreds of years worth of experience and thousands of papers behind this. The Journal of Cleaner Production last year got 29,000 submissions into it. There's a huge volume, but we're being ignored because of the old issue of power, and the establishment felt they were losing, so they needed to pull us back. And that's the thing that really worrying me now, is that we're being pegged back into the solutions are being provided by the people who caused the problem. They're not listening to the scientists. They're not listening to the voices of everybody who wants a decent meal with their family in a warm home.
I suppose just to bring in maybe some conversation around COP. So I had the privilege of attending my first COP this week, which has been an interesting experience, very overwhelming. And one thing that has just been playing on my mind the whole time, and the most interesting thing about it, is actually doing the homestay, the human hotel process. So I've got a delegate staying with me for 2 weeks from Togo. And when he arrived and we picked him up from the airport, as soon as we got home, he opened up his bag and brought out some small bags of maize that his wife had made, and a jar of like this beautiful pepper paste that his wife had made. And he was like so proud to tell us like that this had been homemade and had travelled with him for 2 days. And it was in like an old jar that he'd washed out, and like I just thought that was such an emotional moment of like connection, and it made me reflect on how so much of the love that I show in my life now in the West is linked to consumption. And I don't know how that happened, that love is product. And it just was quite disturbing to realise that actually so much of how I show love to my friends and family is through the consumer capitalist system, and it's very, very difficult, as you were saying, to actually step outside of that. And I think this process of being involved with the film has really challenged me as well to kind of think outside. I work in circular economy, but it's very much thinking about those systems and how you make profit within those systems, and it's been really interesting to actually step back and think what else is in there, what else can I feel and experience. And actually what I'm wearing tonight is rented clothes from a Scottish entrepreneur who's just started a company called Shida, and we've actually become friends through that process as well. So like all these extras where you're kind of reaching out to people, making connections, really like enhances your life. And I wouldn't have had any of those experiences if I'd gone on to H&M website and bought a shirt. But now I'm in this network with someone really interested in exchanging clothes, and yeah, it's really opened my eyes a lot. So it's been a great experience to be part of the advisory group.
There's something very fascinating about how it has, in the past, we've associated freedom with ownership, and now actually can we think about freedom as access and possibility and opportunity. And I think there's quite a profound tension between, which goes to your original questioning, I think, around if you sit down with communities, really wherever they are in the world, and you have space for a conversation and dialogue and discussion, and really say, what is it that really matters to you? No one's going to say it's having the fanciest kitchen or footballer sort of salaries. They will talk about purpose and dignity, housing, as we heard in the film, having safe shelter. They'll talk about health for those they love, safety. And so we've got this really interesting paradox around when people really reflect on what most matters to them. And then we see this system that is almost pulling them away from that. There's this brilliant food expert in America who talks about why is it collectively that we're creating a world that none of us as individuals actually want. And that's why we have to go back to the economic system and stare it down and look at those path dependencies, look at that entrenched system of power and how people who are winning out of this current system can design the rules of the game to win more and more and more. And it's complicated, and doesn't lend itself to placards, unfortunately, but it's a really difficult question around how we design the economic system. And it means being prepared to say that some people, that lovely, beautiful phrase that underpins the SDGs, leave no one behind. I think we have to have a conversation that maybe some people are just too far ahead. And that's challenging, because it means we need to talk about rebalancing. Who is it who's consuming too much? Who is it who's hoarding power? And talk about distribution. And in a way, I think the decoupling green growth agenda is an effort to kick that down the line. Because, okay, so imagine for 1 minute, imagine we can achieve decoupling. Imagine that, if that was possible. We all know it's not going to happen, but imagine we could. So we sort the environmental question. What are we left with? We're left with still an economic system that treats people as just-in-time inventory, is extractive and generates huge levels of economic and horizontal inequality. So it lets the economy off the hook if we're just focusing on this pretendy idea of decoupling. So yeah, these are really difficult discussions, but the good news is, as Ian said, there have been people working on the solutions and delivering the solutions, as you heard from Kate, for decades. And so it's not a shortage of ideas. It's not as if we don't know what needs to happen. And it's not as if we don't know what it looks like either, because we see it in microcosm in so many places around the world. But it's now a conversation about the politics, and that's harder.
Just when you said it always reminds me. You say because it's visible, because what we're talking about is visible. And I don't think it is in microcosm. I think you talk about the SDGs. If you look at the SDGs, absolutely we need to deal with it. We need to do all the things that SDGs stand for and leave no one behind. But if you go through the list, how are we going to do them all and do number 12, sustainable production and consumption? Because absolutely we need better sanitation, we need to address poverty, we need to have food for all of those things, absolutely. But we need to do that within the planetary boundaries. So that's in front of everybody, it's in front of all of the leaders who are signed up to the 17 SDG goals. It's in front of them every day. People walking around with those badges 17 colours. It's in front of them. It's visible. How are you going to do this? How are you going to achieve all of those goals? Because the way we're heading, we're going to achieve 16 of them. And by doing that, we're not going to achieve them because, as we know, the impact of all of the consumption is going to create more havoc environmentally, socially, and economically, globally. So I think that's the point. It's almost that, what's that expression, you know, in full sight of us all, but we kind of ignore it. It's like, you know, the emperor's clothes analogy, isn't it? It's there. Tim.
I mean, I think that's really interesting. Actually, I know the guy who's running, heading up the UN process on that sustainable consumption goal and the 10-year framework of programs, as it was called, which slips off the tongue and means lots of things to lots of people, I'm sure. But I know from the inside that how difficult that process is because, you know, sustainable consumption and production became one of those phrases that was kind of acceptable in UN language because it didn't use the G word at all. It kind of just said, you know, we need to consume differently, we know that. And so, and it's always, and one of those battles inside UNET was consuming differently or consuming less. And the difficulty there, of course, is there are some people in the world who do still need to consume more. So it comes back to your point, Catherine, about distribution. But I've forgotten what I was going to say now. But I guess, it was a question about the film, because I found the framing of the film really interesting, and I wondered why you went with that title when you had Detective Trebek identifying the villain right at the end in her final film noir segment. But I mean, why? Because to me, and I've been involved in the growth debate for quite a long time, as soon as you kind of talk about decoupling one thing from growth, it sounds like you want to keep the framework of growth and you want that to be, you know, you want to make it good growth or smart growth or clean growth or green growth. And that's the problem that the SCP goal has. It doesn't, you know, it sort of slides away from that without confronting it and without finding a different language to speak of it. And what you did in the film, which was, in some ways, maybe it was quite clever, is that you sort of started with that question and then you kind of, by the end, I felt that you were growth skeptics, in a sense. I don't know if that was clever in the editing or if it was...
I mean, that was certainly how the group went.
Yeah.
We were set with this, okay, let's make some nice decoupling, and within about 5 minutes of the first discussion, we'd ripped that apart.
Okay.
And poor old Jack had a long list of notes of how he was going to direct the thing, and that got thrown out the window, and he did a brilliant job in moderating it as we went, no, we need a new systems goal here, and the people around this virtual table can imagine a new systems goal. And then we started, and then obviously, Catherine and her work around well-being said, well, we've got a wonderful thing there that is a humanity at the base of it. Now let's look, and so we didn't answer the question you wanted us to. We came up with our own question we thought was a slightly better one, and went with it. So maybe that's what happened in the film as well.
It sounded a bit like Harry Potter now, doesn't it? you should not be named. So is that what happened?
Did Janine want to reflect on the making?
No, I was just going to say, I think
there's a mic.
There's a mic.
I think the title might have been lost in there a wee bit, but I think what was settled on was Reimagining Scotland. So it came in just after the pre-titles. So it sort of teased the fact that the discussion was originally about green growth and decoupling, but the film was about reimagining Scotland.
I think that's clever. I think that is the way to go. I think that language is the way to go because in a sense it sort of frees you from the prison of the economic structure as it's seen. You know, GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government spending plus or minus exports, and that's the structure that we live in, and therefore, you know, we have to decouple one thing from another thing. But actually when you begin to talk about, you know, reimagining Scotland, then you're back in the territory that Kate was pointing out of, you know, actually what do we want as human beings? And then it's about, you know, connection and meaning and love and relationship and how do we create those things inside our economy.
Yeah, and I think the panel discussion it moved on really quickly from talking about decoupling. I did consider putting in some little Zoom excerpts of people saying this term doesn't work and we need to reimagine something new, and these sort of argumentative discussions at the beginning. But it did move on so quickly, it didn't feel like that was what it was about, and definitely the report that was produced at the end was not heavily weighted towards talking about whether or not decoupling worked. It was really about imagining what is beyond that, I thought. Do you agree?
Yeah, so the title of the report, if I remember correctly, is Principles for Sustainable Resource Consumption Within a Wellbeing Economy. So that's where we started, that's where we ended. And I think you're right about, let's start with the Scotland that we want, and that will ultimately lead to discussions around consumption and well-being, but it doesn't start in the very technical academic language which doesn't connect with everyone. So yeah, it was quite a journey.
Can I just reflect on the significance of Zero Waste Scotland allowing that to emerge and evolve? Because you're a quasi-arm's length government organisation, and I think it's, I don't want to freak you out, but I think it's, I think it's monumentally significant. I think it's extraordinary that to see an organisation like this taking this agenda so seriously, doing so diligently and rigorously, with you know, Jack holding the pen of that report and being prepared to ask these questions. I mean, last year what we saw, the Dasgupta review critiquing GDP and reminding us of the fact that we need to recognise the nested systems. You know, the 1990s Sustainable Development Vision where you had the 3 pillars? That is one of the, I think, the most problematic memes, if that's what it is, because it makes us think that the economy is on a par with society and nature. And Dasgupta, as ecological economists and as feminist economists, have been reminding us for decades. Dasgupta also said, you know, this is a report that came from the UK Treasury, reminded us of that nested system, how we have to see the economy as embedded in society and embedded in nature. It pointed the finger at GDP. We're also seeing these sort of, this pointing to economic growth through so many of the intergovernmental panels on climate change and biodiversity reports, and really starting to, I mean, it takes a lot for scientists to be quite angry, I think. They're the last people to get shouty, and they are not holding back now, making the link between the environmental crisis and our economic growth agenda. And yet politicians are still so hesitant to go there. And I assume if there's, 1,000 people listening at the moment, some of them are not in Scotland. In Scotland, we've got a cooperation agreement between the Greens and the SNP. So they had this nice cooperation agreement. Here's what we agree on. Oh, we disagree on a few things, so let's list them. Top of that list is we're not going to talk about beyond GDP measures and growth agendas, because they're still so scared to have that necessary conversation that communities, that I think businesses, many businesses are up for, and the scientists are telling us we have to change. And that, it's almost, that's the last frontier. So it's why it's so important to have these sorts of reports, not from the Journal of Cleaner Technology, much as it's an impressive journal, Ian, but we have to start getting this conversation on the tables and the inboxes of our politicians and convince them that we as a society are up for it.
The society, I mean, isn't the kids on the street are up for it?
Absolutely.
Because I was thinking, because when you talk to people, you know, people who are not in the, you know, government and economy and stuff like that, they don't understand what GDP is. So it's like, you know, it's a language of a particular set. You know, people don't understand it. So it's like, you're right, they're not up for it because they don't. Well, I don't think they even know if they're up for it or not because they don't understand it. They're up for something else. That's what keeps coming out of those types of dialogues that you have.
So I thought the example that you used was brilliant. So Granton's actually, I live next to Granton. So a lot of the areas that you were showing there, wherever I go for a run, I go past that area. And I think it's a wonderful example because it's down by the waterfront in Edinburgh. This should have been developed 150 years ago with beautiful houses sitting overlooking this amazing stretch of water with access to all sorts of different activities out there. But for many, many years now, it's been an industrial wasteland. across there. Why? Because of the land ownership structure. There's large areas of it are owned by the Duke of Buccleuch, so the access to the land is difficult. So when we go down to some of those and there's above where Granton itself is some of the sink estates from Edinburgh in the 1940s, 50s and 60s. And what you have down at a level of them trying to build is still an enormous amount of struggle and difficulty because we're trying to do all of these things that are recommended within a government that won't take on the vested interests and institutions and break some eggs to make that omelette. And if just one example of I've got a friend, and we were walking along past that area, who is chief executive of one of the housing associations in Scotland. He was one of these conversations where he said they've done some analysis of where they take the wellbeing economy work and try to look at what the house would be that would allow a two-bedroom flat that would allow sitting down with decent-sized furniture, with a meal with your family, a balcony out. Granted, every house should have a balcony looking at you. Do good double, triple glazing for the wind that comes off it. And they've looked at all that to see what that would cost, and it's basically 20,000 more than they can afford when you get the grant rate. And they've gone back with their pens and they've worked out to see how they can squeeze things down. But that £20,000 essentially is because of the house of the price of land, and it's the land banking, etc. So on a very real basis, on a day-to-day, people are sitting in smaller homes, poor insulated, so the Duke of Buccleuch, etc., can stay in charge of Scotland at a very, very local level. So I think we will keep going back to Granton, and we will see the struggle to get that to what it should be as a brilliant place to live, and just the wild swimming that goes on there that's taken part. Fantastic, but it's hard work unless they're prepared to take on the vested interest, and that's where we're lacking.
Could I just come in on? I think so far we've talked about the top-down, those power structures, but as someone, I suppose I'm here sort of representing the younger generation, so I'm part of the 2050 climate group. We work with 18 to 35-year-olds in Scotland, living and working in Scotland, who are concerned about climate change, and we empower them to take action on climate change in ways that are meaningful to them. But what I find really fascinating about this discussion, and Tim, you just said there, the kids on the street want this, but we need to remember that there's also the pressure of growing up under neoliberalism, and actually something that I find really concerning about this whole discussion, and something that's I think is missing a lot of the time, is that for me personally and for the community I grew up in, a post-industrial town, social mobility is tied to resource consumption, and it's a status symbol. And as you climb up that ladder of social mobility, which is pushed in school, is pushed in our communities, you get more stuff and you have a bigger house, and it's all tied up together. And the culture was embedded before I was born. I was born in the 90s and it was already happening. We had all the social housing sold off in my town. It was very much private, home ownership, have a big car. That's part of, and I find it very difficult now working in the sector to communicate with my community about those other benefits that aren't material benefits that can be expressed, in the culture, because it's, as you were saying, it's hard to step outside of it because all the social value is tied up in newness and novelty, and I think we need to remember that not everybody is on board, and we see it in who we vote for, who gets returned to government. I think people in communities on the ground want different things, but maybe they haven't, if you say we want to sit down and have a nice meal together, we want time, but also we've got a pressure to have a big car. So it's how do you square that circle? Those two things are still aspirational.
Yeah, I guess I was referring to the kids in George Square on Friday. I mean, I'm not saying they're not conflicted as well, because I think they are, but, in a sense, that goes to that point. We are what we consume. We are consumers, and our culture is consumerist, and the values are expressed through that. I mean, to me, there's a couple of lessons out of that, and I don't think they're easy to implement, but one of them is that you cannot have one set of people in power telling another set of people who don't have that power and have been brought up in a culture that they didn't ask for to behave differently from the way that social status requires. So, you know, that sense of moralizing about consumption, I think, is wrong. And Mary Douglas was one of my influences. Sorry, Ian, I'm doing it again. But I mean, you know, a lot of people have some quite interesting things to say. Mary Douglas was one of them. She was an anthropologist, and she critiqued that critique of consumption back in the 1970s, saying, you know, who are these moralizers telling other people how to live? Because consumption and the way that we signify status through consumption is about life opportunity for those, you know, kids growing up who have been brought up into that culture. And it probably has been forever, actually, to be honest. So that's the first lesson, is that, you know, we can't change that by talking in pejorative terms about consumption or consumerism from a position of power. And then the second thing, I think, you know, if we believe in what we're preaching, I don't think we're preaching it, but if we believe in what we're suggesting, that some of those other values are worth more than money and consumer things and material goods, then it's about building the infrastructure that provides for the opportunities to participate in those things.
Yeah, I would say, you know, it is about redefining what a successful life actually looks like. And going back to that power aspect as well, we do need to recognise those different balances of power. And so much of our lives as citizens, or viewed as consumers, is to responsibilise us to make changes within a structure that doesn't facilitate those changes because of that power imbalance.
I think it's that point you're making, Deirdre, just about this general thing about there are certain things we've got to work with. You know, there's sort of some evolutionary thing. You know, we have to consume because we are this particular shape. We have to, you know, we have to bring in our calories to us, etc. There are certain elements where we will always be in battles for relative status. So if we go down to but what's different is the new car became the thing that you needed to show your relative status. So my sad little quip to Tim is, because Tim's one of my academic heroes that had a huge amount to do, but I can't possibly compete with him on an intellectual basis. So I made I'll do.
Made lighter.
No, yes,
Thank
exactly. But so what I need to do is be better at the things that I use to demonstrate relative status. So that's Deirdre's point there about the redefining. We're always going to have to consume certain services. The products will deliver those services to us. So as the food delivers the nutrition services to us. But we need to be smart about, you know, when folk are growing up in these areas, what does relative status mean? Back to being part of the community, the skills that they have, the connections that they have, rather than the new Tesla that they have.
So I'm always taking maybe more controversial, because we talk about, obviously in Scotland, about the just transition and the fair transition, and absolutely, you know, that is absolutely right. You know, leave no one behind, as you said, Catherine. But I always wonder whether people don't know what we're transitioning to, and that comes back to, you know, what is it? I mean, my analogy of this, and some of my colleagues will say, so we're in a transformation programme at Zero Waste Scotland as a business. And we get challenged quite a bit. We think that's a great thing. You know, leader of the business, we're in a transformation, we've set out our agenda and all that. But quite a lot of our colleagues say, what are we transforming to? You know, because you have to, and it's a good thing, because you get obsessed by words, you get obsessed by transformation programme. We have a programme team working on it, and we have lots of work streams and all the project management thing that goes with it. But we have to keep, colleagues keep reminding us to keep telling us what we're transforming to. And I wonder whether that, you know, is part of this challenge that we have, particularly in Scotland, or even globally, is we keep getting told we need to transform, we need to move, we need to be, but we don't really understand where we're going. And it comes back to, I guess, your point, Catherine, about the well-being economy, as you framed it. I mean, in some respects, it is what people want, different to what, I wouldn't say the politicians, because that's not fair, but the people who are, you know, or as you say, pointing out we need to change, that we haven't actually we're not on the same page in terms of what the economy looks like or the society should look like together. We don't have a common narrative, or do we? Do we actually understand that we're all trying to get to the same place? And do we all feel that we own that future? Because that's a big thing. I'm just reflecting again, running as a business. You know, that's really key to the success, I believe, of Zero Waste Scotland, that everybody understands where we're going, everybody's bought into that, everybody feels the ownership of that journey as well as the end point, what we're trying to do as a business. And anybody who's been on leadership training will know that that is critical to the success of any transformation, and it's why only 30% of transformation journeys ever work for businesses. So how do you create that ownership? And I just, you know, some of it I feel in the last week, listening to what's happening inside of the Blue Zone and what's happening on the street, and even in the fringe events, because it's not just on the street. I mean, the interaction with people in other venues has been fantastically rewarding, you know, in terms of people coming in, you know, and talking about some of the stuff that's not been talked about. But I do feel that there's not the same ownership of the future. And I think that's what's something that I feel that's rubbing everybody up the wrong way on the outside, so to speak, that we don't quite own the same future. I don't know, maybe I'm being, you know, controversial for the sake of it, but how do we make sure that we're all in that same...
I'm not sure about that, Ian, because I mean, I guess my question back would be, has anybody ever owned the same future? I mean, I'm not sure that they have. I mean, in terms of a vision, you know, for a firm or an organisation to have a vision, and you do have one, zero waste, that's enough. Isn't that enough of a kind of direction of travel? I mean, I like the. I'm a Wellbeing Economy Alliance ambassador, so I have to say this with Catherine sitting there. But I like the vision of the wellbeing economy because it's all encompassing. But I'm not sure that, you know, I would like to think that within that there's scope for diversity and plurality, and the way that people can express their lives and think about their futures. And just the fact that, you know, I'm a generation or two away from those kids on George Square suggests that their future is never going to align with mine, and neither should it. So I wonder, you know, to what extent we're kind of, and I hear this quite a lot. If we knew where we were going, and we'd know how to get there, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it's the case that you have to know which street you have to turn left on next or right on next. You don't have to always have that, you know, total vision in front of you. And with something like zero waste or with zero carbon, we know absolutely what that target is. And within that target, then you know, why can there not be a process of negotiating what kind of vision of what society is and what lifestyles are underneath that? One of my big concerns about, you know, carbon, in a way, is that it's so heavily implicated in our lives that we could quite quickly find ourselves living under a kind of carbon fascism, in a sense. And that's a dangerous position to be in because it's socially repressive. So I think, you know, while zero carbon is a really good aim and zero waste is definitely a directional aim, I would stop short of telling people how they should live their lives, because I think that's a freedom that was hard won. And it's one of the arguments that's drawn against, you know, against the kind of movement, the kind of vision that we're talking about, is that you're trying to take people's freedoms away, aren't you? And that I think is, you know, that's a difficult road to be on. So I mean, it's a sort of question, how much of a vision do we need? How much of a goal? How much of an end point do we need?
And I think on that as well, that it's interesting to think about how limited freedom we actually have within a consumer society anyway. And if you want to live differently, it's very, very hard. And coming back to the younger person viewpoint, I suppose a lot of our members within 2050 Climate Group, there's a frustration there because we don't feel like we have agency except for being consumers. And there's a lot of talk about, oh, if you're a young person, use your limited amount of money to buy a bamboo toothbrush. And it's kind of like, well, that just feels pointless. We're not got a seat at the table. We're not part of any decision-making process. And then we're seeing things being done to us that we have to live with. And we're seeing our quality of life almost regress anyway without carbon reductions. You know, we keep hearing, oh, what about quality of life? And young people are sitting there saying, we've got insecure work, we are poorer than the last generation, we're ready for a big change. Like, it's fine, let's go. Whereas I think some older generations maybe feel like we've worked hard for these freedoms. We've worked hard for the freedom to choose 5 types of butter. And they are sticking with that, whereas it's actually quite repressive when you really think about it, and it's not very freeing at all.
I've got lots to say on that, but shall we ask?
Yeah, I'm always just about to open it up. Is there any other comments as well as questions? Don't feel it's that type of discussion.
Yeah, hi. I'm Amanda for the Wellbeing Economy Alliance. Love this conversation. I just wanted to ask actually why you framed it around consumption as opposed to production, because a lot of what you seem to be talking about actually is particularly manufacturing production's impact on the environment and the price, and you know what I mean, and all of these things that have those environmental impacts. So why was it on the consumption end as opposed to the production?
I don't think that was our shout.
That one for you, Jack. Why was it just framed in consumption, not consumption and production?
It's a good question. I was a policy analyst, so most of the things I looked at was regulating production. And when you read the circular economy literature, a lot of it's focused on policy and regulation around production, and has massively missed out social science and this discussion around well-being, which fits more immediately within consumption, but obviously ties to production. So I don't really have a clear answer. It just kind of naturally went that way. But it's a good question. Maybe it's something for the panel to discuss. I've also got a question, if that's okay. So I wanted to pick up on Tim's point, but also Kate's point, which this is, I guess, a question to the panel, which is, yes, we shouldn't be dictating people's lifestyles. That'll never work. But we have to get from 18 tonnes down to 7 or 8 within a decade. We need to reduce our carbon by 75%. So how do we meet that tension? And I guess to narrow it down, what would you tell the Scottish Government to do next to try and fix that?
Was there another question?
I think answer that one first.
Okay.
If we answer that one, there aren't any more questions.
What's your advice to government? We need to get from 18.4 tonnes per person per year down to something like 8 tonnes per person per year in 10 years. What's the advice? Without that tension between telling people what they need to do.
I mean, I guess to me there are different strategies there, and some of them are kind of production strategies more than consumption strategies. They are, the things that you have to do to impose that, to get to that target in time, requires, as you say, it has to be done more or less in 10 years' time. You've got to get the bulk of that emission reduction, and that means you've got to go sector by sector by sector by sector, company by company by company by company. Everybody has to have plans that would make that feasible to happen. You've got to do it with your housing stock. You've got to do it with your government estate. That has to be almost internalised if we begin to talk this language of a carbon and emissions pathway. It has to be really internalised, and it has to be consistent. You have to not have a chancellor standing up 3 days before COP telling people they can travel domestic flights more cheaply because they've lifted the tax off it. That's the consistency, that's the hard graft of policy that has to be aligned with a carbon policy, in the same way, in a sense, that Mark Carney is asking these 130 trillion of assets under management to get a pathway, too late as it turns out, and while still investing in fossil fuels as it turns out. But if it was done properly, that's the kind of thing that you sort of, you have to put in motion. But that doesn't get to the point that you were kind of asking about, where does that fall out in terms of people's lifestyles? And it seems to me that once you take that seriously, that exercise, that emissions pathway exercise to zero, then you find where that impacts on people's lives and why it impacts on people's lives. And you have to, as I was saying before, build the opportunity for people to lead flourishing lives with low impact. And that means building communities, giving people education, levelling up their chances, ensuring their social mobility, allowing them to express themselves. And one of my big things is that actually the consumer economy, as you were saying, gives away that kind of freedom to make those choices, and giving people back that freedom to live in a different way, to have lifestyles which are more fulfilling, not less, with less material and less carbon. And those, I think, are also tasks for government.
Should I take a shot at the government? Not literally, but kind of. So this year is going to be bookended by two fairly hefty policy documents or reports. So we started the year with the findings of the Scottish Climate Assembly. So a deliberative process, 100 people recruited because they were Scotland in miniature in terms of views on climate, in terms of education level, income status, where they lived, race, gender, everything. The most beautiful audience you could ever get to speak to. It's mini Scotland. And the results of that process, where experts were on tap, not on top, where they were feeding in these beautifully facilitated conversations where it was all about discussing, where people were bringing in the ideas from their own lives, they have come up with very, very ambitious suggestions for government around going beyond GDP, how we change work, universal basic income, passive houses, how we design cities, standards for our buildings, and so on and so on. So that's at one end of the year. What's probably going to be released before the end of the year is the document that talks about the National Strategy for Transformation of the Economy. And my bet from what we're hearing is that it is going to be so blah, 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 there's my quote from someone, in terms of just 20th century recipes, all about sort of faster business as usual, not stepping up to the enormity of transformation that we require, and the consultation process for this document. This is a 10-year economic strategy. It's hard to think of a more important document that's going to sit over policy making for the next decade. Was a pretty rubbish online consultation process over summer. And no wonder people feel shut out of discussions around economics when they don't even really get a chance to feed into these conversations. And what they should be doing is put all that discussion around the strategy in the bin and take the findings of things like the Citizens' Assembly, where people have been at the forefront, that when they've been reflecting on the scale of challenge and where they've really together co-created the sort of solutions that we needed. So my advice to Scottish Government would be put the Citizens' Assembly's recommendation on top of the pile and file in, the drawer marked 20th century recipes. I mean, I'd love to be proved wrong on this, right? So I'd love to be proved wrong, and let's see what comes out of it, because it hasn't been published yet, but I tried very hard to get Tim on that, the Council of Advisors for that document, and we'll see what comes out. But it's not as if we're short of ideas in Scotland around this.
I mean, we come back to what's been said, and it's been said for a long time. If the Scottish Government want to do something about to hit these targets, they need to stop, if we're using an author that Catherine put me onto, Donella Meadows, would talk about the least powerful leverage points in a system. Giving away a little bit of money at the end without the structural changes is, as my old athletics coach used to tell me, it's like tickling my legs with a feather. I might enjoy it, but it's not actually going to do me much good. I was always coming up with ideas how I could be better. I said, Ian, that's like ticking your leg with a feather. So what we need to do is the deep structural changes. So, and that does come down to governance. That means that to having a second chamber that is a deliberative form of democracy. It is about deep-seated land reform, which they can do in Scotland through taxation. It's about not re-establishing the financial institute, establishing it back into things like the Scottish National Investment Bank. There's a number of things that they can do. But I think also we've got to, of what we can do, and all the people within this room and the people who are watching, is that we have to speak truth to power. And I love that. I just love, but of course, Greta's ability with words is just stunning, blah, blah, blah. If you're hearing the minister or the next person up in your food chain talking about green growth, inclusive growth, etc., what you should be hearing is blah, blah, blah. What you should be hearing from them is you're not listening to the science. So we need to sort of turn that around. And then I've read, goodness knows how many things I've read about persuasion. Deirdre, I'm sure, will back me up on this. None of them ever start by saying the person that you're trying to persuade is an idiot. None of them ever starts to something negative. And the way we've always got to build bridges, build this shared humanity. So then in a sophisticated, kind way, provide support for the boldness that is required, because cautious isn't going to get us where we need to go. Cautious is now a form of denial. So I think if we can hear something different in all of those conversations where it is around these things that the science and people's aspirations are saying they want something different, then we might be able to create some shifts, because we might be able to go to the top end of what Donella Meadows says about changing a system, which is changing the new goal to a system and getting people imagining a new goal.
I think there's still one line before we get through now. I'm slightly nervous because...
I would just add to that as well, Ian, about, we clearly do need a whole system change, but as part of that, I think coming back to the production-consumption aspect is a dismantling of the linear economy. I mean, that's critical. We can't sort of just layer on top of that. We need to both incentivise more sustainable approaches, but dismantle the unsustainable thing that we have there right now.
I totally agree, and Reimagining Scotland would say that as well. That, and the thing about the linear economy is it didn't happen overnight. It's been built over, you could argue centuries, and it's deep-rooted, not just in terms of consumption, but lots of our infrastructure, the hierarchy that sits around it is based around that. So I'm thinking about insurance, I'm thinking about accountancy, I'm thinking about banks, lending. All of those things are very aligned to the delivery of the linear economy, investments and all that sort of stuff. So it's not going to happen overnight. So you're right. How do we? And that's the challenge. Do we put all our efforts into the circular economy and hope it takes over, or do we have to back both horses in the sense that we need to start dismantling one of them and bringing the other one, which is a dilemma that we talk about at Zero Scotland quite often, about what's the play here, what does that look like, what does that 10-year strategy look like. But absolutely, it is, and I can't remember the phrase the other night about, some of these are, it's quite challenging to start saying you're going to dismantle something. Everybody likes to create a new vision, a new world, a new way of, a new order, or something different, a new process. Everybody can get quite excited. But when you say to people, we're dismantling what you're working within, or supporting, or otherwise investing in, although we have, obviously, we recognise that some of these conversations are happening in terms of climate change. So, yeah, it is a challenge. I agree. Two things we picked up on there: the economic transformation programme. So we obviously fed into that as Reimagining Scotland, but we haven't seen the output of it either. Although it was our scientists that fed into that, so hopefully they will listen to the scientists at Reimagining Scotland. I took part in the Citizens' Assembly as well, and it was what an experience, because they were really challenging. They were all, obviously it was virtual, but you were made available to them, if that's the right word, for a very deep-rooted session, an open session. Then they had workshops, and you went around the workshops, and the questions that they were asking, they were, even for me, I thought they were quite challenging. So, but they really did grasp the enormity of not just the challenge, but more importantly, the opportunity. And it comes back to that framing of what they were thinking good success would look like was perhaps a lot different to what we talk about sometimes. So anyway, I've been very patient, so.
It's a question that probably blows the whole thing open, so it might need some wine. But my name's Alistair Henderson. I'm from BAM. We're a construction business, and I'll absolutely confess here and now I'm a wellbeing economy beginner. So it's been a very interesting conversation for me. I don't even know what question I want to ask. I mean, I was thinking about the type of oil tankers you are thinking of turning around here. And now, not only are we trying to turn them, we're trying to dismantle them. And that's, as an engineer, I can tell you that's a whole different game again. I know in my business that my investors, when I build infrastructure, are often pension funds who are wanting to fund, through growth, the cost of paying for somebody to live for the same period of time after they've worked for the rest of their life. I also recognise everything you say about the attractiveness of the quality of life that people in Western Europe have. I mean, that's an attractiveness that is, you've seen almost as seen as a social entitlement, and that's why people go out to that consumption. It's also an attractiveness that draws economic migrants from across the world in a literally life-threatening way to have the thing that we have. And again, I'm drifting in terms of the question I get. The question I've got in my head, I guess, is a how question. And I look at what we want to achieve as Scotland, what we want to achieve in this decoupling of consumption from growth. I look at global population growth, and I need to know whether growth, GDP growth, if you like, in a global sense, is needed in order to fund that, or does this imply less for everybody? And can Scotland do this in a way that sits in the world when the economic system we've got is so deeply embedded, so intrinsic in everything we do, that you're asking everybody to make the change at the same time? Sorry to be to be bleak, but that's my question, I guess.
So 5 questions in there, Alistair. I'll take one, and we can spread them across the. I mean, let's keep chatting because there's heaps in there. So you said you're a wellbeing economy beginner. Did you do jigsaw puzzles over lockdown? Were you one of those people? Right. So, I mean, the changes we need for a wellbeing economy are so many. And I think of them a bit like sort of pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. We need circular economy. That's part of it. It's necessary, but it's not sufficient. We need community wealth building. Necessary, but not sufficient. We need beyond GDP measures top of our government. Necessary, but not sufficient. We need economic democracy. We need more worker cooperatives, and so on and so on. So there's heaps that needs, and luckily there's a movement out there, and there's pieces behind each of those pieces of the jigsaw puzzle. There's people saying, here, let me put this in here. How I sort of start to conceptualize that. So if you're doing a jigsaw puzzle, apparently the best thing to do is you start with the corners. So the 4 corners that I'm sort of conceptualizing this sort of change we need are handily 4 Ps. So it's about purpose. You know, what is the very purpose of our economy geared up to be about? It can't just be faster GDP growth, and that's how we're currently describing recovery. It has to be about putting human and ecological well-being at the forefront. It's about prevention, because at the moment we collectively spend a shed load of money doing, sort of trying to, and often pretty poorly, attending to the damage and the collateral damage of the current system, whether that's carbon capture, sequestration and storage, whether that's top-up wages because people's jobs don't pay them enough to live on, whether it's housing benefits because of the dysfunctional housing market, whether it's cleaning up after it's like an onion, and you can all picture those sorts of people. And this chap here has just published a report on that around the extent of failure demand in Scotland and Alberta. So prevention is another one, really looking upstream and how do we stop these things happening in the first place. And circular economy is a great example of getting that right from the beginning rather than creating damage. And we start to get into an affordability question here too. The 3rd P is around pre-distribution, which is a really, really ugly term, but I think it's one of the most exciting concepts in terms of getting the economy to do much more of the heavy lifting. So designing the way the market generates outcomes so they're more equal from the beginning, and that's things like shifting ownership of wealth, cooperatives, taxes, living wages, prices, so that they're more aligned to what, more accurate pricing. And then, of course, the final P is people-powered, and that goes back to citizens' assemblies, participatory budgeting, participatory planning, more deliberative participatory democracy.
you put those corners of your jigsaw together and you start to see the pieces that come into place. I will pass the harder questions to smarter people than me on the panel. That's Kate.
I got carried away with the jigsaw. No, because I was given, thank you, brother, a jigsaw which was in black and white. It takes us back to our film noir theme. And a black and white jigsaw, I mean, most of it was black, I have to say. If anyone wants to try this, it's a picture of Johann Sebastian Bach, and it's got the text, bring back the beat, or something, where back is spelt B-A-C-H, of course. And I mean, my point is, I started that strategy. I started with the four corners, and thinking that I could get from the four corners to straight lines. I found the corners, that was relatively easy. But I couldn't get any beyond that until I realized that in each place on the puzzle, there was a slightly different texture of black. And that's what I focused on. And I think there's an analogy there. I know I'm stretching it, but it is late. And the wine is just around the corner. But I think to answer, my answer to your question is that there is not a single overall solution. And it's particularly the case where it comes to growth, because there are places in the world where income growth still matters. And that came very clearly out of the work that I did when I was Economics Commissioner on the Sustainable Development Commission. Life expectancy doubles when you can increase the income of poor people. Infant mortality falls, maternal morbidity falls, participation in education rises, and we have to keep that in frame, even as we, address the obvious point that growth-based model in the advanced economies is driving the whole thing to unsustainable levels. But I do think that, that point about different textures in different places on the puzzle is really my learning from lockdown jigsaws.
I'll just kind of end, if that's okay, by I guess I'm interested in how positive you're all feeling, particularly focused on what's happened in the last week. Your experience, I'm sure you've been around, you've said that, Kate, you've been in and out of the blue zone, or just watching from afar. I could say a number between 0 and 10. 0 is very negative, not feeling very good. 10 is absolutely fantastically positive. So based on what's been happening in Glasgow over the last week, how are you all feeling? Go on, shout a number out.
Can I go as 1 when I'm in the blue zone, 8 when I was at the march, and it would have been 10,
I'll allow that.
And then 10 from here today. So just.
Brilliant. Does that anybody else go for that? We all feel the same. So Kate, you've been in the blue zone. Would you echo that?
I think, coming back to your question, that was so interesting because it seems it's competing ideologies, and that's what I feel in the blue zone. And as someone who's going to only be in my 50s by the time we're supposed to have reached all these magical targets, I go into the blue zone as a consumer and I'm saying, what are you selling me? And I don't like it, I don't want to buy so far. So that's quite scary for me, because the ideology within that space doesn't match what I want from the rest of my life. So that's quite frightening.
Yeah, I'd agree without putting numbers on. I think there's two different things definitely going on. There's a blue zone vibe and a definitely different vibe. So I'll go with that. Okay, well, thank you everyone. Thanks for staying. I'm conscious that the sound guys will want to finish up soon. So thank you, sound guys and lighting guys. And again, my team, I've spotted Chris there as well, who's been doing the online stuff for us. So thanks again. But yeah, just to finish up, so again, there is some wine left, so we've got another 15-20 minutes. Opportunity to network and just get the questions you didn't get a chance to ask. But once again, I'd like you to put your hands together for our panel. Thank you very much.